7 last plagues. Having had 3 weeks winter break, I now want to continue our consideration of Revelation. At the beginning of July, I spoke about the Red Heifer because once again it became a hot topic, with the Temple Institute poised and ready to move toward the construction of the third temple, which is to be built by human endeavor. But, as Yeshua said during his trial in Mark 14 verse 58, I will destroy this temple made by hands, and in 3 days I will build another one, not made with human hands. We can see clearly from those words, he is the one who will build it in the third millennium. So try as they may, the Temple Mount Institute will not be the ones responsible for building that new temple. So while none of this was mentioned in Revelation, it does link in with all that is destined to occur following the return of Yeshua. So today I want to continue on with the studies of Revelation, considering chapters 15 and 16. Here again we have seen in so many of the earlier chapters the sequence of events in Revelation are not chronological. Chapter 15 is like another turn of the kaleidoscope, where the same characters move around and show yet again another dimension of the same vision. In verses 1 and 2, Yochanan says, Then I saw another sign in heaven, a great and wonderful one, 7 angels with 7 plagues, and they are the final ones, because with them God's fury is finished. I saw also what looked like a sea of glass mixed with fire. Those defeating the beast, its image, and the number of its name, were standing by the sea of glass, holding harps which God had given them. The words clearly suggest that the events Yochanan is about to be shown occur sometime after the restoration of the reign of Yeshua. Yochanan does not say who those ones standing by the sea of glass were, the ones holding the harps. But regarding the sea of glass, we're told in chapter 4 verse 6, it is the area in front of the throne of the heavenly throne room. So the people standing there must be the ones who were finally made immortal, because as Yeshua says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 58, Let me say this, brothers, flesh and blood cannot share in the kingdom of God, nor can something that decays share in something that does not decay. Yochanan continues in verse 3 and 4 to say that they were singing the Song of Moshe and the servant of God and the Song of the Lamb. Great and wonderful are the things that you have done, Yahweh, God of heaven's armies. Just and true are your ways, King of the nations. Yahweh, who will not fear you and glorify your name, because you alone are holy. All the nations will come and worship before you, for your righteous deeds have been revealed. The Song of Moshe was the same one that was first sung by Moshe himself, as Israel stood on the shores of the Red Sea and looked upon the dead bodies of the Egyptians. The Song of the Lamb appears to be the one sung earlier by the 4 living beings and the 24 elders, who together who sang, You are worthy to take the scroll and break its seals, because you were slaughtered. At the cost of blood, you ransomed for God persons from every tribe, language, and people and nation. You made them into a kingdom for God to rule, Kohanim to serve him, and they will rule over the earth. So the Song of the Lamb was earlier sung by all present round the throne. It appears likely that the ones now singing the Song of the Lamb are the 144,000 because in chapter 14, verses 3 and 4, it says, I heard a sound from heaven like the sound of rushing waters, like the sound of pealing thunder. The sound I heard was also like that of harpists playing on their harps. They were singing a new song before the throne, before the four living beings and the elders. And no one could learn that song except the 144,000 who had been ransomed from the world. So it appears that after these things have been restored, following the 1,000-year reign of Yeshua, the whole heavenly community is preparing for the final showdown with the beast and Satan, the adversary. As we read in chapter 20, verses 7 through 10, when the 1,000 years are over, the adversary will be set free from his prison and will go out and deceive the nations in the four quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is as countless as the sands on the seashore, and they came up over the breadth of the land and surrounded the camp of God's holy people, the city he loves. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them. The adversary who had deceived them was hurled into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were. The events in chapter 20, verses 7 through 10, bring the whole restoration process to completion and pave the way for the great white throne judgment, which continues in chapter 20, verse 11. Which is why, returning to chapter 15, and starting in verses 5 and 6, we see, after this I looked, and the sanctuary, that is the tent of meeting in witness in heaven, was opened, and out of the sanctuary came 7 angels with 7 plagues. Verse 8 continues by saying, the sanctuary was filled with the smoke of God's Shekinah, that is, from his power, and no one could enter the sanctuary until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels had accomplished their purpose. So moving on into chapter 16, we see that the 7 angels take their 7 bowls and progressively pour them out on the earth. All this appears to occur at the time spoken about in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. Many end-time commentators are currently putting forward the idea that we at this present time are seeing the outworking of Revelation chapters 15 and 16 before the return of Yeshua. But it is very clear from the words of Revelation 20 verses 7 through 10 occur after the completion of the 1,000 years of restoration. So we see the first angel poured out his bowl, which caused all who had received the mark of the beast to be covered with sores. This reflects what occurred during the plagues of Egypt, where in Shemot, Exodus, chapter 9, verses 8 through 11, Moshe threw the ashes from a kiln into the air, and it turned into fine dust that inflicted both men and animals with sores. But the heart of Pharaoh grew hard, and he didn't listen. Returning back to Revelation 16 verse 3, when the second angel poured out his bowl on the sea, it became like blood, and everything died. In the same way, the third angel poured out his bowl on the rivers and the streams. They all turned to blood. The effect of the pouring of the second and third bowls was again similar to what happened in Egypt. In Egypt, during the first plague, all the rivers and streams turned into blood. But while there is no mention in the Exodus account about the sea turning to blood, it seems quite reasonable to assume that the Red Sea got its name from that very event. As we see in Revelation 16:3, when the second angel poured out his bowl on the sea, it also turned to blood. As the verse does not mention any specific sea, we can assume perhaps that all the oceans and seas of the world were similarly impacted. Then following the pouring of the third bowl, Yochanan records that yet another angel, vindicating the actions taken of those who had received the mark of the beast, says in verses 5 through 7, O HaKodesh, they poured out blood of your people and your prophets, so you have made them drink blood. Then I heard the altar say, Yes, Yahweh, God of heaven's armies, your judgments are true and just. In verse 6 says that Yahweh even makes them drink blood, one of the things that were forbidden for all humanity in the days of Noah, straight after the flood, when God gave humans permission to eat animal flesh, but never blood. By contrast, in Isaiah 49:26, Yahweh says, I will feed those with their own flesh. They will be drunk with their own blood, as is with wine. Then everyone will know that I, Yahweh, am your Saviour and your Redeemer, the Mighty One of Yaakov. Those words are being spoken about the actions of Yeshua, about whom the preceding verses 24 and 25 say, I will fight those who fight you, and I will save your children. Again, in Ezekiel chapter 38, verses 21 to 22, Yahweh says, I will summon a sword against him through all my mountains, says Yahweh Elohim. Every man will yield his sword against his brother. I will judge him with plague and with blood. I will cause torrential rain to fall on him, his troops and many peoples with him, along with huge hailstones of fire and sulfur. In those verses, Yahweh is addressing Gog, whom he calls the chief prince of Meshech and Bavel. It is against Gog's army that the 7 plagues of Revelation chapter 16 are being directed. It is also reflected in the words of Ezekiel 38 verse 18, when Yahweh said, When that day comes, when Gog invades the land of Israel, says Yahweh Elohim, my furious anger will boil up. Yahweh then concludes his discourse with the words in verse 28, I will show my greatness and holiness, making myself known in the sight of many nations. Then they will know that I am Yahweh. Returning once again to Revelation chapter 16, in verse 7, Then I heard the altar say, Yes, Yahweh, God of heaven's armies, your judgments are true and just. Those words are vindication that what was occurring during the outpouring of those 7 bowls is fully justified. It's fitting that those words are heard coming from the altar, because during the pouring of those bowls, the sanctuary was filled with the glory of Yahweh. So it was from the altar of sacrifice that the words came. It may well be that from that time onwards there will be no more sacrifices, as the 7 angels with those 7 plagues were on a mission for the last great sacrifice, which ended with the removal of Satan and his cohort from the universe. Moving on once again, this time into verse 8, we see the 4th angel pours out his bowl on the sun. And if we apply the 21st century knowledge to this event, it sounds like it is a massive outburst of plasma ejected from the sun. Because, as verse 9 says, the people were burned by the intense heat, yet they cursed the name of God, who had the authority over these plagues, instead of turning from their sins and giving him glory. Now, David Stern, of blessed memory, says in his commentary on this verse, they cursed the name of God instead of turning from their sins. Although God has the authority over these plagues, these unbelievers in their irrationality, instead of entreating the one who could help them, curses him. They recognize that God controls the plagues, but blame him instead of themselves. Since being amoral and materialistic, they see no causal condition between their own sinful behavior and these events as judgment. They remain unrepentant throughout the chapter. Again, in verse 10, when the fifth bowl is poured out, we are told that it is poured out on the throne of the beast, and his kingdom grows dark. Probably because of the intense heat of the sun, they gnawed their tongues because of the pain that they had to endure. Again, because of their collective plight and anguish, they continue to curse the God of heaven and refuse to turn from their transgressions. So moving on yet again, we come to the pouring of the sixth bowl on the great river Euphrates, so that the water dried up. There has been much explanation given as to why the Euphrates River was the target of that sixth bowl. So I'm not going to offer a new suggestion on this issue, apart from saying that it is linked to the statement made in the verse that follows, starting in verses 13 and 14, where we are told Yochanan saw 3 unclean spirits that looked like frogs. They came from the mouth of the dragon, from the mouth of the beast, and from the mouth of the false prophet. They are miracle-working demon spirits which go out to the kings of the whole inhabited world to assemble them for the war of the great day of Bavel the Great. The 3 demonic spirits have been let loose after the adversary is released from the pit, or go out on his behalf to assemble many kings for war against Bavel the Great. Having been absent for 1,000 years, the kings and their subjects, who had been aching for the release of their master, are finally able to cause mayhem. So we saw earlier in Revelation chapter 20, verse 7 to 10, Gog and Magog, with many others, advance over the land of Eretz Israel and surround the camp of God's holy people and the city he loves. After they have wreaked havoc, they are consumed by fire from heaven, and they all end up in the lake of fire and sulfur, along with the beast and this false prophet. Therefore, coming back to verse 12, we are told that the Euphrates River dried up to prepare the way for the kings of the east. Given Scripture has said nothing about the kings or peoples of the regions of the far east, it may well provide kings and their subjects who join forces with Gog's mob and partake in the battle against Bavel the Great. Verse 16 says that the 3 demonic spirits gathered the kings to the place which in Hebrew is called Ha-Megiddo. Once again, turning back to David Stern's commentary, paraphrasing his words, he suggests that the original text, which was most likely given to Yochanan in Hebrew, spoke in that place about it being Mount Zion, where the battle takes place. This reasoning is based on the translation of the original place name, firstly from Hebrew into Greek, then secondly from Greek into English, where Ha-Megiddo may well have been originally Ha-Migdo, which means the mountain of God's blessing, Mount Zion. When we consider those words again alongside Revelation chapter 20 verse 9, where Yochanan speaks about Gog's horde advancing and surrounding the camp of God's holy people and the city he loves, that certainly sounds like it's referring to Jerusalem. Again, in Joel chapter 4 verses 1 and 2, we're told, "Then at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Yehuda and Jerusalem, I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. I will enter into judgment there for my people, heritage Israel, whom they scattered among the nations when they divided the land. The valley of Jehoshaphat is also known as the Kidron Valley, which lies east of the Temple Mount, between the Temple Mount and the Mount of Olives. Again, the location is right outside Jerusalem. So the likelihood that the final battle will take place in and around Jerusalem appears to outweigh Har Megiddo, which overlooks the Yisrael Valley in the central part of Israel. The disaster that Yahweh will bring upon all the nations that join with Gog's horde will finally and totally be destroyed, as Jeremiah was told when reflecting on the final outcome for those nations who come against Jerusalem. Finally, we come to the seventh bowl, which is poured out on the air. The pouring of the bowl brings the final purge of the earth and the kingdom of the adversary to an end. Yochanan hears a voice from the throne saying, "It is done." Then in verse 18, there is yet another upheaval on earth. As it says, there were flashes of lightning, voices and peals of thunder, and there was a massive earthquake, such as had never occurred since mankind had been on earth. So violent was the earthquake. Then an interesting comment is made in verse 19, that the great city was split into three parts. The cities of the nations fell. And God remembered Bavel the Great and made her drink the wine from the cup of his rage. Next week, I will look more closely at the details of Bavel the Great in chapter 17, where it is given the title Mother of the Whores of the Earth and its obscenities. 17 verse 16, the 10 horns along with the beast will hate the whore and bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They eat her flesh and consume her with fire. But it appears in verse 19 that Yahweh is making her drink the final cup when he brings an end to the whole structure of Bavel the Great. That has plagued God's people, Israel, since the time they became a nation. The words of verse 19 are also reflected in Yirmiyahu or Jeremiah chapter 25 verses 15 and 16, where Yahweh said, "Take this cup of wine from my hand and make all the nations where I am sending you to drink it. They will drink, stagger to and fro, and behave like crazy people because of the sword that I will send out among them." Yirmiyahu was sent out on a mission sometime shortly before the first temple was destroyed. So we can see, even back then, Yahweh was preparing the nations for the ultimate destruction of what they had collectively done towards the people of Israel while Israel dwelt in Eretz Israel. In verse 17 of Yirmiyahu says, "I took the cup from Yahweh's hand and made all the nations drink, where Yahweh had sent me." Then in verses 18 through 26 he gives a list of all the cities and countries where he had been sent. They were all surrounding nations and had a direct contact with Israel during the time Israel dwelt in Eretz Israel. That is, up until the first temple was destroyed. Yirmiyahu concludes his list by saying, "Indeed, all the kingdoms of the earth that are on the surface of the earth." But then he adds, in the same verse, an extra king, saying, "And the king of Shishak will be the last of all to drink it." The name Shishak is part of an ancient Hebrew coding system that conceals the name Bavel. The name Shishak cannot be found on any ancient or modern maps, It appears that Yahweh used that name to conceal the name and the place of the king that would be the last to be made to drink the cup of God's fury. So returning to the list of nations that were to be made to drink that cup, we find in Jeremiah chapter 25 verse 33 that Yahweh Zebaoth says, "Disaster is spreading from nation to nation. A mighty tempest is being unleashed from the farthest ends of the earth. On that day, those killed by Yahweh will be strewn all over from one end of the earth to the other, and they will not be mourned, gathered, or buried. They will lie on the ground like dung." It is a sad ending that awaits the people who so willfully hold Yahweh in contempt. Along with their master Satan, the adversary, they will cease to exist in the universe eternally. But in keeping with their fate, Yochanan concludes in chapter 16 by saying, "Every island fled, no mountains found, and huge 70-pound hailstones fell on the people from the sky. But still the people cursed God. It was such a terrible plague." So next Shabbat, we will look at chapters 17 and 18 and see what is destined to happen to the world in the not too distant future. So until then, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.